Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are right now. Welcome to the Community Participatory Mapping Method Seminar. We are delivering this to you online because of the situation that we are in right now. And we hope that this video finds you in a safe, comfortable, in a healthy disposition. We know that it is a very difficult time right now. So we hope everybody's safe while viewing this webinar. So for our webinar, make sure that you have the activity Google Slides open. You are also viewing this at your own pace, so you may do the activity later, or depending on your availability. We are very open to answer your questions. Please post it on the same Google Slides where you're going to do your activity for this webinar. This webinar has 4 parts. First, community mapping lesson will be delivered by Zoe, and then we will zoom in on the use of balloon mapping, which Joel will lead us through. And then on the third part, we will know how to use the data that we will generate and how are we going to analyze these maps. And this will be delivered by Michaela, and then we will wrap this webinar up at the last part. We have 5 learning objectives. First, at the end of this webinar, we should be able to introduce to you community mapping and participatory GIS. We will explore various types of community mapping techniques. We will learn how to do community mapping using balloon mapping as an example, and understand the applicability of community mapping depending on your research project. We should also be able to learn the process of participatory GIS. So first, for the community mapping lesson, let's just define first what is mapping. This is a very simple definition that we got from one of our references, that it is any method where people are encouraged to use a map or maps in order to communicate their knowledge and ideas more clearly. So this is a very simple, but there are also other definitions out there that define mapping in terms of defining the problem, finding solutions in a certain area of focus. As long as you use maps, then you are doing mapping. But then what is community mapping? It is a process carried out by the community for the community. You should be able to use map as details of where they live and the surrounding infrastructure they're in, encourage and empower communities to take action for themselves, puts them in a strong position to represent themselves with the stakeholders that they are engaging in because of the knowledge or the information that they could gather from the mapping process. It could also build capacity within the community. So learning how to map, learning what are the issues, it builds capacity with for the community members. Lastly, it understands problems and learn what are the available solutions within a community.
Thanks, Paula, for getting us started off in a good way. So before we go too much further into this webinar, let's just take a second and talk about what can we map. Think back to the first time you ever saw a map in your life. Maybe it was a globe sitting in the corner of your bedroom, or a giant map of the world in your classroom in one of the early grades at school. Of course, those maps highlighted countries, oceans, but the short answer is you can map a lot more things. So let's talk about a few of these things. One term often used in research related to mapping is assets. So what are assets? Assets, quite simply, are a useful or valuable thing, something with value. The other term often used is capital. Capital would be wealth or something owned, something valuable. So for our first activity, I want you in a second to pause this video and take about 5 minutes to brainstorm a list of all of the different assets you can think of. Don't worry, I'll be here when you unpause. So pause the video now and brainstorm a list, writing down in your notebook all the different assets you can think of, things of value. Welcome back. Now look at your list. You've brainstormed a list of a whole bunch of assets. Maybe you've come up with rivers, streets, or perhaps you've gone down the route of businesses. Looking at this big list, can you see any categories emerging? Are there things that are missing? Pause the video again in a second and try to group the assets you brainstormed into different categories. Once again, I'll be here when you get back, so pause the video now and group your assets into different categories. You can choose the titles for the different categories. For example, you could say the outdoors if you chose to. Pause the video now. Welcome back again. Okay, so you have your list of assets and you've broken it now into different lists of categories. Hopefully that's provoked some thought in your mind about the different kind of assets we have and therefore the different things we could map. On the next slide, let's start to look at the different categories that researchers have already came up with. The first one we'll discuss is natural assets. So this is referring to our natural environment. When you were a kid, again, you saw those bodies of water and countries. So this is water, food, mineral, wildlife, fertile soil, things like that. All of these slides, by the way, are referenced at the bottom from a study done by Tamarack Community Library, accessed online. Let's go to the next slide. Maybe you had as one of your categories built assets. So these things are our physical structures, buildings, public infrastructure, recreational facilities, utilities, things like that. On the next slide, we see economic assets. These are things like our jobs, our businesses, and our resources. Perhaps on your list, you have the local coffee shop that you go to. You could map restaurants in a city or dry cleaners. Economic assets are, of course, very important. Then there's public assets. These are things like our medical, educational, and social services, hospitals, schools, municipal government services, also very easy to map. Here's where it gets more interesting to me. Social assets are things like our values and our culture. Here, we're talking about traditions and attitudes, things like sharing, cooperation, and mutual support. And in our final slide, we're looking at intangible assets. These are things like expertise or underutilized skills, or perhaps even something like willingness to volunteer towards a common goal. Social and intangible assets are, I would argue, more difficult to map. So how do we map the social and the intangible? This is where it gets more interesting to me, and it relates to some of my research, so I'll take a slight diversion. I'm very interested in something called social capital. Social capital is, briefly, the bonds that are created between people. And this relates very much to the work of American sociologist Robert Putnam, a leading scholar about social capital. Putnam and others have done a lot of investigation into how to build and how to measure social capital. In his capital theory is that social networks have value. So therefore we could say they are an asset. Putnam goes on to explain that the term social capital itself seems to have been independently invented on 6 different occasions between 1916 and 1980 by a variety of different people, including educators, sociologists, social theorists, and even the famous urbanist Jane Jacobs. But chronologically, the first user of the term social capital on record is L.J. Hanafin, who was at the time the state supervisor of rural schools in West Virginia. Hanafin explained social capital as including what he called tangible substances, such as goodwill, fellowship, sympathy, and social intercourse. Then, in The Death and Life of Great American Cities, Canadian American writer and urbanist Jane Jacobs herself writes that social capital is the sum of casual public contact between people in a city that creates a web of public respect and trust, which, if properly nurtured, leads to a continuity of people who have forged neighborhood networks. These networks, Jacobs writes in her books, is a city's irreplaceable social capital. So these networks have value, but they have yet to be adequately mapped. How can we think about social assets as a created space that could be recorded in some way? This is, again, a diversion into my work, but hopefully it provokes your mind to think a little differently about what can we map and how can we map. And I think it's a great opportunity for people like artists to explore creative ways to map. But I digress. Thanks for your patience. I just wanted you to think about the diversity of assets that are out there. Back to you, Paula.
Thank you, Joel. That is a very insightful take on the opportunities that underlie mapping and the possibilities how we can use mapping to understand our assets. So now let's take a look on the applicability of community mapping for your research projects. So we found this decision tree from one of our references, which could aid you in finding out if community mapping is suitable for you. So to start, you ask yourself if there is any significant spatial component in your project. If your answer is yes, you ask then, do you want to communicate that spatial information to a wider group of stakeholders or other professionals? Then if your answer is yes, do you have in-house GIS capability in your research project or your research team, or you have funding to pay an outside contractor? Then if your answer is yes and you have resources, then GIS-based mapping might be a good option for you. Then if your answer is no, then and you wish to use a better understanding of that spatial component to change how the people you want to involve think about it, then you may employ community mapping in your research project. But I think it still depends on your research objectives, even if you are a GIS expert, but then your research is about finding common ground on people, and you are using mapping as a tool to enhance social cohesion, then this decision tree is limited for you. So it still depends on your research objective. So this might be more helpful for projects that haven't or considering projects that are considering community mapping. So now let's call on Zoe. So now let's call on Zoe to talk to us about the process of doing mapping.
Okay, thank you, Paula. One good thing about this method is that you can design a mapping strategy to meet the needs of your own personal research. Community participatory mapping techniques can be adapted to the type of data you're looking for and can suit large or limited budgets and timelines. As we've learned from Joel, there are countless tangible and intangible things that we can map, and Hayden explains that we can visualize opportunities or limitations that are imposed by race, class, location, politics, and other factors. We can use a variety of applications to do so, and these applications that we're about to discuss may be designed and executed to align with traditional, social construction, artistic and evocative, participatory and collaborative, critical change, systems thinking, and or pragmatic criteria that Patton describes in Exhibit 9.7. So with all that being said, let's take a look at some of the ways we can map with communities. So if you're anything like me, cartography thought about when we started talking about mapping. Maps are a great way to depict a variety of things in a community. These could be physical characteristics, values, jurisdictions, resources, relationships, and much more. This application is useful for starting a conversation and learning about the local setting, culture, and people. Maps can be provided and drawn on by participants, or they can draw their own, as Kevin Lynch did in Los Angeles in the 1970s, which I'll show you on the next slide here. So Dolores Hayden outlines this work in her book called The Power of Place, Urban Landscapes as Public History. This book discusses how identity and politics are tied to geographic place. Here you can see an example of a citizen-made map of their neighborhood on the left-hand side of the slide. Lynch was interested in spatial limits that are imposed by race and class, and how political divisions of territory created different communities that were and still are experienced by many perspectives. As an urban planner, he used cognitive mapping to learn more about urban spaces by asking people to draw maps or give him directions. He was interested in their mental images and in learning about inequalities in access, territory, and memorable features of different neighborhoods around the city. Maps produced by participants were used to create one composite image or an overall map of the neighborhood, which is shown on the right-hand side of the slide. So moving on to our next application, which is timelines and trends. This involves having participants delineate timelines and trends to kind of engage in a cause and effect analysis. It allows people to provide a first-hand account of local events and trends, and you can start to put the pieces together as a researcher. It gives you a chance to compare timelines across jurisdictions, which might be interesting depending on your research topic. And it also shows how customs, practices, and other things can change over time in an area. I think this would be useful for studying climate change impacts or healthcare practices or a variety of other things. So next I'm going to talk about seasonal calendars, which is a fairly simple mapping application. By focusing on a variety of local factors such as rain or snowfall, crop yields, or industry layoffs across time, researchers are able to gain understanding of larger patterns and processes that are at work and how they impact localities. This could be used to study employment, climate change, program development, marketing, or other cyclical things. The next application is time use analysis. This reveals local place and power dynamics by indicating the amount of time, type of uses, feelings, and people that are involved in certain places. It is useful for researching activity patterns, relationships between people, and how these things change in the short and long term. I think it'd be useful for planning studies, looking at social capital, and market research. The next method is Venn diagramming, which involves having participants make Venn diagrams, and it's useful for learning about local relationships and power dynamics. The diagrams reveal the significance and complexity of dependence between individuals, groups, institutions, or industries. They can also indicate where there are shortcomings, redundancies, and help identify opportunities for change. This application could be useful for program evaluation and development and social and political studies. Next, we have well-being grouping and wealth ranking. In this application, participants group and rank households, neighborhoods, regions, or just groups of people based on local criteria. It is useful for identifying vulnerable communities and potential opportunities for improvement. I use the term community here because that could mean a physical area or a subset of people in society. This exercise allows researchers to examine how people perceive, experience, and respond to challenges like involving social issues, health or healthcare, politics, and economics. It'd be useful in social studies, public policy, needs assessments, and other research. And moving on to our final mapping application, which is matrix ranking and scoring. It involves having participants rank the importance or significance of resources. These resources could be things like nature, equipment, healthcare services, education services, and other factors. And you have locals rank these resources based on their own criteria, which are developed considering things like productivity, accessibility, efficiency, effectiveness, and other values. In doing so, your participants reveal local preferences and decision-making strategies. This would be applicable to infrastructure planning, prioritizing action items, marketing, or program development.
Thank you, Zoe. And now one of the things that we prepared for you is a specific method on mapping, which is balloon mapping. And I think Joel is very excited for you to share with you how it works. So Joel, are you ready?
Absolutely. Thanks, Paula. And thanks, Zoe, for that very thorough walkthrough of all those different opportunities. So before we talk specifically about balloon mapping, let's just put it into context in the article we asked you to read in advance of this webinar. So that article, of course, is Cooking Up a Storm, Community-Led Mapping and Advocacy with Food Vendors in Nairobi's Informal Settlements. And it was authored by Sohail Ahmed, Edwin Simiyu, Grace Githiri, Alice Sverdlik, and Shadrach Mabaka. And hopefully everyone had a chance to read the first two sections of that article. We all found it pretty interesting, and we hope you did too. You can see on this slide right here is an image taken from the article that shows a little bit of their process that these researchers did, and it's very much a feedback loop where they're working from brainstorming to focus groups and focus groups plus, through to hybrid mapping on the ground and the air, and back to analysis of data, which feeds back into more community consultation. If we go to the next slide, we'll just place a little more emphasis on this study, both as an example of what kind of data you can get and what else you can get. Remember, we asked you to read this article with one focus question, and that is, what else other than mapping data do you get from participatory community mapping? So in this study, community participatory mapping was community driven. Lots of quotes within those first two sections about how the community was engaged and involved. But it's really important to note that food vendors themselves realized the need for additional data to help transform the negative perceptions they encountered. And in particular, there was a group of female food traders who wanted to lead and engage in these discussions and in mapping activities. So it was very much community driven. It was mixed with other methods. As has already been pointed out by Zoe in her previous slides, these methods go really well with other qualitative methods, such as focus groups or focus groups plus, which is a term for combining focus groups with other methods, such as mental mapping. They really emphasize in the article, as you read, that focus groups are more open than surveys or interviews, so they work really well in concert with mapping. They began with brainstorming of the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, why, surrounding their research question. And the meeting itself also doubled as kind of a training for the methods that were going to be used. So it was mixed with other methods, engaged with the community, and then used to identify priorities. This is where the brainstorming is so important, because you're actually going to the community and saying what is important to you. And this has some resonance with our colleagues who presented a couple weeks ago on knowledge creation. So a shout out to that group for preparing us so well. So to answer our question that we asked you, our focus question, What else other than data? Well, data was captured and the community was also engaged in this process. So that's a little context. Of course, you've all read the first two sections of the article. So now let's jump to talking specifically about the method that was mentioned called balloon mapping. So why balloon map? What are the advantages of balloon mapping? Other than, as you can see by the pictures, it's pretty darn cool. Well, balloon mapping gives you current data. Existing satellite images of an area, as we all know, are often out of date. So you could get real-time data of your hyper-local community. Also, although there is some cost associated with balloon mapping, it is relatively affordable. It's low cost compared to high-tech methods like getting a drone and a drone license. And finally, it can be not only current, but very specific and tailored to your exact needs. So, for example, in the study mentioned in the article, it was used to capture hyper-local data about vendors, the infrastructure, and the environmental hazards that these people face. So let's look at what you need to do to balloon map and how you do it. Shout out to the folks at Public Laboratory for Open Technology who used balloon mapping in 2010 to capture images of the Gulf of Mexico oil spill. The folks at Public Laboratory claim that this is where balloon mapping was born. And in the study that we asked you to read about, it yields quite a bit of data. The 90-minute flight that they did in this study yielded about 5,400 images. And Ahmed and colleagues call these community satellite images, because not only is the community involved in those focus group discussions and focus group plus discussions and brainstorming sessions in advance of the flight, but they're actually out there flying the balloon together with the researchers. So they really are community satellite images. So what do you need to do to balloon map? Well, if you want to be like super rogue, you can just go and buy a whole bunch of helium balloons at the party store and rig up your camera. But if you want to follow Public Lab's advice, they do sell a balloon mapping kit for $100 US. It includes a reusable balloon and a whole bunch of hardware to strap to that balloon. I won't go through that in detail now, but you can pause this video if you want to take note or check out Public Lab's website. You'll also need to supply your own continuous shooting camera and an empty 2-liter pop bottle. Here's some logistical challenges you might face though. What if you can't get the kit from Public Lab? We weren't able to, so we started thinking, how do we do it without this kit? And then when you don't have their kit and you're going with a rogue balloon or set of balloons, how much helium do you need? Then there's a moral challenge. What about the helium shortage in the world? And what if you can't find the right fishing line to attach to the balloon? How much pressure do you need? How much tension? What and how do you attach? And what if you're not so handy? And what about the weather? You can't really balloon map on a super windy day. So these challenges aren't insurmountable, but they are logistics that you're going to have to look into if you want to do this with your research participants. So I gave it away a little bit. We did order a balloon, and we were super excited to fly this balloon with you. We couldn't get through to Public Lab, so we ordered this balloon online from a company in Virginia. It's called a Cloudbuster from Balloons Direct. It arrived, we started to work out our hardware system, and then, of course, we are all busy at home, social distancing. So it's not exactly the time to be community mapping together. So although we were very excited to fly this very balloon with you, we'll have to settle for YouTube. So on the next slide, we have a couple short videos to watch before our break. If you can't click on the screen to get these links, we've also put them in the email that we sent out with this webinar link. So you can watch a video by Lifehacker and a video by Public Lab. Get the popcorn ready. They're just short videos though. And hopefully it'll give you a taste of balloon mapping. Unfortunately, we can't be out there flying a balloon together, but this is the next best thing. After these videos, please get up, stretch your arms out, walk around a little bit, take a break, and we'll come back for Act 2 of our webinar.
Thank you, Joel. That could have been very exciting, and we all know how we were so stoked to do this with our classmates, but we have to settle for YouTube right now for our safety, for our health. But yeah, so with all these methods that Zoe was telling us earlier, and also with the data that we will generate from balloon mapping, what do we do then with the data? So now we have Michaela to walk us through how do we analyze the data that we get from community mapping. Hi, Michaela.
Hi, Paula. Thanks very much. And thank you, Joel, for that very informative session there. So if we just move one slide ahead here, the question that we are going to talk about for a little while next is how do we analyze the data that we get through mapping? As Zoe showed us, there are many, many different forms that mapping can take. So this section on data analysis is going to focus more on the typical kind of maps that we think of when we say the word map. So the ones that have spatial information directly laid out and tied to the other types of information that we're adding to them. So if we do community participatory mapping, in many cases, this data ends up being analyzed through some type of GIS system. That stands for Geographic Information System. So what exactly is Participatory Geographic Information System? There we go. Participatory GIS is, it can take many different forms, but general definition is provided here from Forrester and Cinderby. So it is the practice of gathering using traditional methods such as interviews, questions, focus groups, and using some form of paper maps to allow participants to record spatial details. So as we talked about before, community mapping is very often used in concert with other types of qualitative methods. It works really well. For example, if you are doing an interview and you are collecting spatial data at the same time, you can ask your participants certain questions and you can direct them in terms of how they go about providing you spatial data in their answers and recording it physically on the map in front of them. Once that information is gathered, it goes through a process called digitization. So this is exactly what it sounds like. You take a physical map with drawn on additional data and you convert that data into onto a geographic software program, different calculate GIS software. And then outputs can be built using all of the different layers of information that you've gathered from various participants. You can build a composite form of a map in order to have a solid final finished product to give back to your community, and in order to allow them to then validate that information and tell you whether it is accurate and correct. So a big question in geographic data analysis is it a qualitative process or is it a quantitative process? The line between qualitative and quantitative analysis when it comes to participatory mapping can be really fuzzy, especially when geographic information systems are involved. So a big question in the literature and throughout the evolution of feminist geography and participatory GIS is there's been a little bit of a fight about whether qualitative mapping is actually an oxymoron. GIS's roots are very positivist, and so in the past it was kind of assumed that yes, qualitative mapping is an oxymoron because GIS is strictly quantitative in nature. As feminist geography kind of took off and social science wanted to expand into geography and mapping as well, we've had a pushback, and there's now a large group of social scientists and others who say, no, qualitative mapping is absolutely possible, and we can kind of mash up qualitative and quantitative methods within geographic information systems and produce very, very valuable outputs. So let's take a little bit of a closer look on what some quantitative analysis procedures might look like. We're not going to focus very much on this side of it because this is a qualitative methods course. So quantitative analysis of geographic data is done using a geographic information system. And in many and most cases, this includes geographic information system software. GIS technology allows us to tie spatial data or tie non-spatial data, to distinct spatial locations within a software and store it in a database. And then it allows us to do many, many different types of operations with that data that we've collected. So we can look at only certain categories of the data. We can stack it up on top of each other. As I talked about before, we can put it all together and create a composite map of everything that we've collected. And then many different mathematical calculations can also be applied if you want to get a little bit more technical. But we're going to focus a little bit more on how you might analyze qualitatively using a GIS. So participatory action research is the methodology that participatory GIS and community mapping usually fall under. And that methodology is really advocates the involvement of all research collaborators at every step of the research process. So ideally, if you are conducting participatory action research or community-based research, that's another name for the same thing, you are involving your participants all throughout the research process, from designing the question all the way through to analyzing the data. This does not always happen in real life, but that's kind of an ideal outcome of participatory action research or community-based research. So when we're doing community participatory mapping, data production and analysis can sometimes actually happen at the same time within the same workshop. So as you are asking participants questions and getting them to collaboratively give you answers and talk with each other in order to come to consensus, through that process, they can also collectively decide on what is the most meaningful way to interpret the data that they've produced. This can happen through formal conversation. It can happen through your later analysis of conversations that happened in the room. And in some cases, map data can actually be coded by the researcher using a similar technique to how we would code interviews or transcripts. And then the results brought back later to the participants in the community to validate the data. Again, that's another principle that we ideally always want to achieve when we do community-based research or participatory action research, is making sure that our outputs are reflective of what the community believes to be true and wanted to create through this process. Geographic information systems have also been shown to be able to analyze this qualitative data in actual qualitative ways as well. And that's work predominantly done by a woman named Sarah Elwood, who is referenced at the bottom of this slide here. So what do our outputs actually look like if we go through these types of procedures? They can range, they can look like many, many different things. This slide shows one example, courtesy of previous work done by Paola, actually. And this is an output of a collaborative community-based mapping project that was done with youth. So your output from your mapping product might look something like this, or It could differ very much, and it might actually look something more like this. This is work done by Tobias with Indigenous communities throughout Canada. And this map was produced using geographic information system technology. There was some qualitative and quantitative methods of analysis that were utilized in order to produce this map. But just to give you a taste of the very, very different types of outputs that might actually be produced from a community mapping exercise after the analysis process as well. In order to give you another idea of how this might look, we are going to do a collaborative activity here with everyone present. And we're going to base it on a theoretical scenario that the school is undergoing. So here we go. The world has recently emerged from a months-long lockdown undertaken in reaction to a global disease outbreak. Preventative measures put in place early on have proven to be highly effective, resulting in a best-case scenario outcome for the province of Saskatchewan. University of Saskatchewan President Peter Stoichev has proposed that a monument be erected in the bowl to commemorate the event as evidence that collective action and solidarity can overcome even the most dire of obstacles. So, recognizing that the bowl is a space used by many and for many purposes, he has gathered a group of student participants to help decide where the monument should go. The participants in this case are you guys. So we are going to ask you to just flip your tab over to the Google slide link that we sent out in the email along with the link to this video. And once you have that up and running, I'm just going to run through an example here just to give you a taste of what this is actually going to look like. So there we have the Google Slides, and open onto slide number 3. We have some instructions in the speaker notes box at the bottom of the screen, but I will walk you through it verbally here as well. So once you open up this slide, what we're going to ask you to do is to record your use of the bowl on this map. And with everybody's answers kind of coming in at different times, they're going to sit on top of each other, and we're going to watch this map change as you guys watch this video and follow the instructions. But here we're going to get Paula to do it for us. So she is going to use the shape tool and the line tool up at the top of the window there in order to add onto the map the areas that she uses. And she's not going to tell us what she uses them for. If it's for a little bit more directly engaged, we might be able to incorporate that into this activity. But for now, we're just going to find out where are the areas of the bowl that are being used. And based on that information, ultimately, we want to answer the question, where would the best place for this monument be in order that it wouldn't be too interruptive of people's general use of the bowl. So Paula likes to take shortcuts. That's good to know. I'm sure many of us do. And remember to try and think about your use of the bowl in all seasons, not just in summer or spring right now, but where are areas that you generally use all throughout the year, and to include all of those. So once that is up there, we will have a nice debriefing session, ideally on Wednesday, March 25th, when we can talk a little bit more about the outcome of this exercise, and we can kind of collectively analyze it together as a group. Awesome. I'm going to pass it back over to Paula to wrap us up.
So on our last part, we're going to wrap up what we've discussed in the last hour during our webinar. And to start, we will discuss the benefits and challenges. Michaela, you want to talk about this?
For sure. So I've made a table of some benefits and challenges that are typically experienced when doing community mapping and almost more broadly participatory action research in general. These were taken from a textbook by Halseth, Markey, and Manson, as well as a method guide for community mapping by Tobias. So some of the benefits that are commonly identified as making this research really worthwhile and worth doing is the opportunity for enhanced social cohesion in communities. Often the communities that are worked with in these types of projects are quite small, and it really can provide some really good opportunity to get people out, get them together, get them talking to one another, and get them all on board for a similar cause. There's also a potential for GIS training and other types of knowledge sharing among the researcher and the other collaborators, and just among the collaborators themselves. So just getting people together in the same room, you automatically have those opportunities for sharing what they know with one another. Third, the ability for this type of mapping to account for multiple perspectives is really valuable, and it's something that makes it valuable beyond just what we typically see in regular GIS use or mapping done by a single cartographer. And then fourth, the ability to tailor outputs to the local context and to community needs. However, there are some challenges that people typically do experience with this type of work. The big four of these are achieving the ideal level of investment from the research participants. So if just getting that community all on board and gung-ho about the project in the first place, it can be a really challenging thing to do, and it can take a lot of time and resources. Accommodating needs and interests that are sometimes divergent among your participants. So having a bunch of people in the same room does not mean that all those people are going to have the same perspective. So it goes hand in hand with the multiple perspectives in one output, but it can be challenging to try and accommodate those sometimes opposing interests. Third, as a researcher in this setting, you do have to be able to be flexible and to let go of your control over the research. Not completely, but in order to accommodate all of the perspectives that need to be involved, that's something that the researcher has to do. And reflexivity is something that can really help with that process. And then fourth, emphasizing research process over research products. So sometimes as researchers, we have a lot of pressure on us in terms of funding and expectations of our institutions, and all of these various pressures that are maybe coming from different things, and it can make it really challenging to kind of emphasize that process and taking the time that it needs in order to produce this kind of research. Thank you, and I'm going to pass it on to Zoe to talk about our major takeaways from this presentation.
Thanks, Michaela. So we hope that we've shown you what a valuable and diverse research method community mapping can be. The main points that we want you to take away from this webinar are that it's a powerful research tool for qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods research. It is possible for high and low budgets and large or limited timelines because you can use high-tech equipment or craft materials and set up in a variety of locations. It is compatible with a lot of other research methods, including but not limited to interviews, walking interviews, surveys, focus groups, document analysis, workshopping, photo voice, and more. Researchers can gain knowledge that might not otherwise be available through traditional sources, and you can empower communities and legitimize their perceptions, opinions, and experiences, which is really important. Overall, it is a great way to co-create and share knowledge, but it is very important for the researcher to be both culturally and contextually sensitive and use appropriate and accessible materials or technology.
Thanks, Zoe. So now we'd like to leave you with one last takeaway question: how to apply some of the things we've talked about today. And for me, one of the most interesting parts of this course has been hearing from you, my colleagues, about the diversity of research that you're embarking on. And we're going to kind of flip that now. How could you use community participatory mapping in your own research project? And don't take the easy road out and just say, no, I wouldn't do this, or it's not interesting. Actually, take a little while to mull this over and think, if I was going to use this in my project, how would I use it? We won't make this an assignment or anything. You've done lots of participation already. We really appreciate it. But as you're falling asleep tonight, maybe reflect on how this might resonate with your work.
And that ends our webinar. Thank you so much for viewing this very informative video that we've come up. For questions, and if you have any other concerns, or if you have comments, please leave it on the third and fourth slide of our Google Slides. And we would love to hear from you. If you have any other innovative ideas about community mapping, please do share. Thank you. And here are some of the references that we have consulted in coming up with this webinar. We hope that these references would lead you to useful information about community mapping and participatory GIS, and you would consider in employing these methods if it's applicable to your research. Thank you so much for your time, and we hope that you've learned a lot. On behalf of our team, thank you, and stay safe, healthy, wherever you are right now. Thank you.